Can everybody hear me all right? Okay, tech check, we are good. Okay, so I'm going to launch right in. Glad you guys got some sugar in you and everything else. Everybody can be happy and hopefully awake for the rest of the presentation. So you want to build a plugin. So you probably know about a ton of plugins that are already out and about, Sprout plugins, Smart Map, Super Table. We are not going to cover anything like that today. So as Leah mentioned, I am a front-end developer, kind of a full-stack developer on Craft. I do not build gigantic user-focused plugins like some of the folks here do. My kinds of plugins that I make are typically small ones for client needs, like if you need to hook up to a CRM service, or if you need to add like a certain twig filter or something like that. So we're going to be starting kind of at that level. And then hopefully you will have all the lessons that you need to build yourselves up to these kinds of levels of plugins. So if you've never built a plugin before, good. This should be good for you. People in the plugin lab yesterday, sorry, you may be bored. So I'm kind of talking about this because in Craft you need plugins. Like for those of you who have been in like WordPress land, sometimes we've used and abused functions.php to just like throw random stuff in there in order to like do random stuff like what a twig filter would do and stuff like that. But we can't do that in Craft. You have to build a plugin, so it's a really good skill to have, even if you are more of a front-end developer. I will amend that statement slightly, because in Craft 2 you need plugins. Brandon was just telling us a little bit yesterday about something new to Craft 3 called modules. So for things that are very client, very site-specific, that would maybe in the future be in a module. It's going to look a lot like a plugin, but is slightly different. Of course, they will be coming out with more info on that later on. I am just covering plugins today. So on the agenda, we're going to be covering anatomy of a plugin, and then I've got 3 different examples to kind of enforce the anatomy. I'm going to be spending most of my time on the first section, though, because I think these concepts are going to carry over from Craft 2 to Craft 3 great. And if you guys walk away today knowing just where to put your code, I think you guys can kind of get the rest of the way from there. So we'll be spending most of our time there. So anatomy of a plugin. Mostly there are directories everywhere. And there's just a lot of scaffolding. Like if you're writing a pretty small plugin, then your scaffolding is going to be like 80 to 90% of your code. Little asterisk for if you're writing something like Sprout Forms or something else, and you're bringing a lot of your own code to the table. This isn't going to be true, but this is kind of true for a lot of the plugins I do. So deep breath. We're going to go through the list of scaffolding, and it's going to be long, but bear with me. So here are all the parts that you can have in a plugin. There are console commands, controllers, element types, field types, migrations, models, records, resources, services, tasks, templates, translations, twig extensions, variables, widgets, and with Craft 3, we now have utilities, which Brandon mentioned before. So that is a lot of stuff. I'm sure a lot of you are feeling a little bit like this at the moment. But I assure you that you're not going to be using all of that, and we're going to kind of walk through it. And to kind of reinforce that, here's kind of like what a normal, what a plugin could look like if it had all of those things. A lot of these things do correspond to actual directories in your plugin. So you can see we do have all those console commands, controllers, etc. as actual folders, and then we'll have files in those. So yes, and then we have all those things in a Craft 3 plugin. So if this is new to people, basically we took a lot of those same pieces and they're moved into a source folder. Resources stays at the root for some of our images and stuff. And then there is also a composer.json that's pretty important per plugin. I'm not going to dive into that now, but just you can see it's all the same stuff, just shifted like a directory down. So a lot of stuff I'm talking about is going to correspond to both 2 and 3. So yes, you're never going to have all of those things. That list is super intimidating. But you only really need to bring what you need to each plugin. You don't need to use everything. That's just all that a Craft plugin can do. So I'm going to kind of pick through and only cover some of these. These are the ones that I use the most. So we're going to shorten that list a little bit to something a little bit more manageable. So controllers, models, records, resources, services, templates, twig extensions, and variables. I am going to cover those a little out of order, though, because some are a little bit more important than others. And the rest that I'm not covering are in like an optional section at the end that we're probably not going to have time for today. But just in case we do. Phew. Another deep breath here. Let me get a nice drink of water. Okay, so before we dive into those sections that I mentioned, I did want to kind of get one thing out of the way that you might see a lot, and that's defaults versus multiples. So say you have a service file that might be called plugin name service.php. So let's look at a real world example of what that would be, context service.php. So when I talk about services, you can have a default file for services, which for my contact plugin would be context service.php. Or if you have multiple services, that file name and the class name for that ends up looking a little bit more like this. So when you have multiple services, you end up with that underscore, and then so plugin name underscore type of service service.php. This doesn't carry over for every type thing on the list that I mentioned, but that kind of pattern carries over for a lot of it, including controllers. If my default controller for contact controller is going to be controller.php, or contact underscore list controller, etc. So just kind of getting that out of the way. If you see some of that in my code, I'll try and address some of the differences between if you have a default or multiple. So services. Again, this is a directory, so everything I'm talking about pretty much has its own directory. So this is where most of your logic goes. This is where most of your actual like written stuff goes. That is your own code that isn't scaffolding or anything else. This is mostly where you're going to be working. And other parts of your plugin talk to your services. So the bulk of it goes there, and then we do a lot of like hooking up to kind of trigger our services. And then other plugins can also talk to the services that are in our plugin. So an example of that would be if I'm like saving a contact and I have a save contact function in my service. Somewhere else, some other plugin could save a contact using my plugin if it's set up correctly. So what that kind of looks like when you're actually calling a service function is craft plugin name underscore service. Again, this is if you're using like multiple services. You can just use plugin name if you're using the default, and then the function name on the end. So real world example of that, this is with using the default service, craft contact save contact. If we're using a list service, craft contact list save contact. This is, of course, the craft 2 version. There is the craft 3 version, which looks slightly different. And then there's also a caveat with craft 3 where you have to register your service with a like camel case name. So there is an extra step here to set up that like contact list part of this. You may need to use a slash. So yeah, just to give an example of that, this is going to trigger a save contact function that is in my list service. So it's going to have the exact same name. Pretty good, right? Controllers. So controllers are where your actions go. And I mean this both kind of figuratively and literally. When I say literally, I mean as in like a form action. So if you have a form on the front end and you want to trigger some piece of code in your plugin, then you can add this hidden input type, name of action, and then a value of plugin name / controller / function name. Again, we have a distinction here between when you are doing if you have a default controller, then you don't need the middle part of that segment. Say we have our list controller, then you kind of add that in the middle. Craft 3 kind of follows this last pattern a little bit more since you're registering things. And then, of course, that hooks up to a function in your controller. I will just point out that this function is not called save. This function is called action save. So all of the functions that are triggered by forms and things like that in your controller are going to follow that pattern. So it's got to start with action. And controllers talk to services a lot. Again, bulk of our code is going to go in services. So our user form is going to trigger your controller, and then your controller kind of talks back and forth between your service. There is some logic still in controllers, though. Not all of your logic goes in the service. So your controller, like a good way of distinguishing between the two is the logic that should go in a controller. It should handle the order of events and the repercussions. So let's validate some of the information we're taking in, send it to the service, let it handle any like saving of data or whatever else. And then the controller can also like reroute the user back to like a thank you page if that was successful, or give them an error. Variables. So variables are kind of a layer between your plugin code and your Twig templates. You can't just use a function that's in your service in your Twig templates. You have to put a variable in between. So that kind of ends up looking like this in your Twig templates. Craft.pluginname.variable function name. Unlike services and controllers, there's no default multiple thing here. You're only going to have one variables file. So less confusing here. So again, using our contact example, it's going to look a little bit like that if I want to like spit out a form from a variable, or if I want to get somebody's name from a submission I have stored, or if I want to get the data for that whole submission and then use that in my Twig template a little bit. So this is hooking up to the variable. It's going to be called the exact same thing within my variable file. So form for contact.form. Same for like get submission name or get submission. Those are all going to be one-to-one. And variables talk to services a lot too. So you'll have your Twig template talking to the variables, and then that will talk to your service and send some data back to go into your template. So a lot of my variables end up looking something like this, where pretty much the only line of code in a variable is hitting a service to get some information. Very little logic here. In Craft 3, that's going to look a little bit more like this. Note that we're just losing craft with parentheses, and instead it's craft : $app. Not too much else changes otherwise. So models and records. So models and records, it's easy to understand what they do. They're kind of set up your data models, which is pretty self-explanatory. But then using them in practice can sometimes be a little confusing. So I've been kind of reusing this slide where we have like things talking to services, but we're actually going to move the service to the middle a little bit. So your service ends up talking to your models and your records, and kind of spitting that back to your controllers and variables. The difference between these two things is they share data models, so they should both have kind of like the same structure. But models are more for validation. You kind of put your data into a model, and you can actually do like this model arrow validate. Like, does this actually match the data model that I have set for my model? Whereas records are used for actual database interaction. So a record is really works with like the database that you create. Like a record talks directly to a specific database table and will add records to that, find them, delete them, all that stuff. I'm not going to dive into code for that one just yet, but you'll probably see it in one of my examples. So that covers a lot of our list. So that's 5 different things. These are all of the parts of your plugin that deal with like dealing with data. I want to take data from a user, I want to save it, I want to spit it back out to them, all of that stuff. So these are all the pieces that totally go around data management. The other 3 are pretty simple. Templates. Yay, we're back into Twig. So this might make a little bit more sense. So you end up with Twig files inside your templates directory. But in this case, these aren't templates for the front end. These are templates for within the admin panel in a lot of cases. So we use these for settings and for control panel sections and things like that. Resources. I'm not going to go into resources too much. Resources have to do with your assets, and by assets I don't mean craft assets. I mean like CSS files, JavaScript files, images, things like that that you need to pull in for the plugin that you're making or the control panel pages that you're making. Like I said, I'm not going over that too much. One thing that you might just see a lot is typically you have a resources folder in your scaffolding just to have like your little plugin logo. You guys probably want to have like a nice little SVG logo for your plugin, right? So that kind of ends up in there. And then twig extensions. You want to add a twig filter, you add a twig extension. So that's kind of a nice one-to-one. The last thing I'll cover that wasn't originally on my list is your plugin root file. This kind of stores a lot of little stuff. So in Craft 2, your root plugin file, which is just the base starting class for your plugin, what it does is it sets plugin variables like the name of your plugin, who wrote the plugin, what your URL is, so they can contact you when you have issues with the plugin. It also stores the plugin version number. So you'll see that 1.0.0 is usually what you start with, or, well, probably shouldn't start with 1.0.0. Should probably start with like a 0.1. Setting some plugin settings. This kind of gets moved in Craft 3, but setting up your settings. Importing twig filters happens here. Setting up certain hooks happens here, and then also setting up control panel routes. All that doesn't take up a whole lot of code. It's just that's where it goes. On Craft 3, like I said, there's a couple little changes. Your version number is no longer in this file. We use Composer a lot in Craft 3, so the version number kind of moves over to the Composer file for the plugin. And then also settings get moved. They're no longer just in this one file. It gets moved to its own model. So pretty much you're just loading up your settings from your existing model in this part. But not too much else changes. We still have hooks. They look very different in Craft 3. The actual code that you use looks very different, but you do all the same stuff. So I'm going to suddenly make all of this a whole lot easier. Pluginfactory.io. Some of you know it. We do have another speaker who built it, so you can always ask him questions about it. You're like, but this thing is really a lifesaver. All this stuff that I mentioned can be a little bit overwhelming, and the scaffolding, just copying and pasting all the scaffolding can be a little bit overwhelming, and this tool makes it a whole lot easier. You can pick what version of the plugin you want to build, whether it's 2.5.x or 3.0, and it will kind of put things together for you. It has these nice little toggles, so all the things that I have mentioned, if you think you need it in your plugin, toggle it on, hit download your plugin, we'll build my plugin, and you will have the scaffolding already set up for you. And like I mentioned before, the plugin scaffolding is like 80% of your plugin, so hey, you're 80% done already. Okay, so now we're going to actually see what all of the crazy things I just mentioned actually look like in a plugin, and we're going to start with the simplest form of plugin that you can imagine, which is just adding a twig filter. So if I were to start at pluginfactory.io, I would just toggle twig extension. There's no other parts to it, so that's pretty much all you've got. And with that, don't worry, I'm not live coding. I'm just going to kind of go through the code a little bit. Let me actually go a couple more over. I think this is the one time I will not have to bump up my text size, don't you think? So let's see. So this is the scaffolding that I just got for the plugin that I want to build. So the plugin I want to build is actually called AutoLink. So this is a tiny thing that I made before. So if a user puts a URL into just a plain text field, we can do something on the front end to like make sure that they have HTTP or a slash or something starting with it, because some people just like to type in google.com, but that's not quite right. That's not quite what we need. So it's the tiniest little filter. So the scaffolding has spat this out for me, just with pretty much everything named and all the files that I need. So we have our root plugin file, which is going to set up the initial class. Pluginfactory.io does have an option for turning on the very verbose code commenting, or you can turn it off. I've chosen to leave it on in this case. So you might see a lot in here. So this is just going to set some things up for us. We've got, it's called AutoLink. We've got a description, adds the AutoLink filter to twig. You might have a documentation URL, get release feed URL. And at least in Craft 2, you can totally like delete these if you don't have those. Get version. So like I said, our version number is stored right in this file. Get schema version, that's optional too. Get developer, you can see my name. Developer URL, bigot.com. Has control panel section, so that's what CP stands for, control panel. So if we were to have like a separate tab in Craft where we would have users kind of set things, that would be true. In this case, that is not true, that is false. But you can see we are adding our twig extension. So that scaffolding is already there for me. We're adding plugins.autolink.twig twig extension. And then there are a few more hooks and stuff in here that we're not going to worry about right now. So I am going to shift over to, oh wait, let me show one more thing on scaffolding. So the scaffolding is going to give you a couple more directories here by default, which is resources. And that's going to be in there so that you can put in like icons and things like that. And then there's also translations. Those kind of just come by default. You don't really need them unless you really do want to do translations and all that. But pretty much the only code in here that we have to worry about is this twig extensions, autolink twig extension.php. And there's not much in this file either. So it's called autolink. And then the scaffolding is going to give us some filter, new twig filter method, and then we're going to trigger a function that's further down in this file. In this case, it's some internal function. So this is the scaffolding. So it gives you a lot to just work off of as a base. Now I'm going to show you my real version that I made before. So just kind of filling in my version here, I'm creating the autolink filter, and then I'm going to trigger the sanitize link function here. So you can see I'm just throwing in my link. It's just going to test to see, does HTTP, HTTPS, does it start with a slash or does it start with a mail to? If none of those things are true, we're going to make sure that the link starts with HTTP. Ta-da! And then actual usage ends up being pretty easy. So this is going to be our actual usage in a twig file. We have a nice twig filter, bar, autolink, and that will correct to http google.com, which I do actually have here. It works. Now you guys have seen autolink. So there were only really 2 files in that whole plugin that we had to touch. That being, again, the root plugin file, just a couple of little configure things, and then the actual extension. And here's where most of our code is. It's not much. That's a very small plugin, but you're probably going to work on something a little bit bigger than that. Twig filters only go so far. So let's look at another example that has controllers, services, and settings. Again, we're going to go back to pluginfactory.io, but we're going to turn on a few more toggles. Controllers, services, settings, and variables in this case. So this is going to be our Bronto subscribe plugin. So with this plugin, I'll kind of show you what it looks like in Craft. Settings, plugins, you can see we have autolink installed, but then we also have Bronto subscribe. So Bronto subscribe is basically a little subscription widget. We just want to be able to spit out a form, take in an email, send it to Bronto, which is a CRM if you've never heard of it. I personally like MailChimp. Oops, sorry. I personally like MailChimp, but this was a client need, and it wasn't too hard to make either. But there was kind of a requirement working with our copywriter. She really wanted to be able to kind of change our error messages and make sure that we could have like some really friendly copy. That was something we really wanted to do on that site, was kind of fill in the gaps and make all those little error states a little bit more fun. So we are taking in a lot of settings. So let's take a look at that. So we have Bronto subscribe. This is going to be a little bit less verbose. This is a plugin I wrote a little while ago. Pardon my snake case. That should probably be camel case. I will show you a Craft 3 version of this that is properly fixed in that area. But how we're going to do that is here in our root plugin file, you'll see we have a lot of the same stuff. We're naming the plugin, we've got a version number, get developer, all the people who built it and everything. But then here's our define settings function. And you can see I just have an array here, and here's everything that I'm storing to the database under my plugin settings. So I'm taking in a token, a list ID, error text, success text. All of those are just strings. And you can see I'm definitely saying that this is going to be a string, and in some cases I'm setting defaults. And then another thing that I'm doing in this file is I'm saying get settings HTML. So I'm setting up a route for where, well, the route already kind of exists for where the settings is going to be. That should be its settings /plugins /Bronto subscribe. But I want to tell it where my template is. So I do have a settings file in my templates. So this is just kind of hooking me up to the HTML that I'm using for my settings page. That shouldn't look too crazy because, again, we have Twig. It is kind of great that for all of our settings pages, for all of the pages that you're going to make in the control panel, it all uses the same stuff. It all uses Twig. Everything that I'm going to show you for controllers and services and everything else, we can do all the same stuff on the front end and the back end using kind of the same system. So here you can see I'm using forms.textfield. So the control panel does come with some macros already set up. So there's a text field macro that I can already kind of use. I just have to pull in. You see at the very top of that file, I have import include /forms as forms, which is what's letting me use those macros like text field. There are various other fields too. I just happen to only be using text ones right now. So that makes it really easy to build that page. If I go back to my plugin, this is the exact code that's building this settings page. If I change something, it will save. You failed. Save. And of course, that change is still there. So not too much. They make it pretty easy to set up settings with Craft 2. With Craft 3, that looks a little bit different. So I have my Bronto Subscribe plugin in Craft 3. This is going to look a little bit different. Let's see, not variable. Plugin. So here's my root plugin file. In this case, you can see it's pulling in a lot more stuff. There's a lot more scaffolding here. But the relevant part of this is here at the bottom again. Create settings model, return new settings. So settings are now a model. But we're still setting up our settings HTML. It looks a little bit different, but we're doing the same thing. And then our settings model kind of looks like this. So I'm kind of setting up everything I want to save. In my init function, I'm kind of double checking what I want to have and setting defaults. And then I am setting some rules here at the bottom, like the first couple of things are required. And then we have the rest of these, pretty much all of these are going to be strings. So that's what that looks like. And then as far as controllers, so one other thing that I am doing with this plugin is in a variable, I am spitting out a form. So I am in control of the form that is going to spit out for this subscription. There is a little bit of a trick to doing that with Craft 2, and Craft 3 also, because your template path is going to be not quite right. It's going to be looking for stuff in your craft/templates. So you have to do this little trick where you save the template path, change the template path to your plugin, get the HTML you want, and then change it back to the old path. A lot of stuff, but it gets you there. So I'm spitting out my form, which looks like this. Again, we're working in Twig, but this might look a little bit familiar from my previous example. I've got a hidden field, name of action, with a value of Bronto subscribe /send. So remember from our previous example, this is going to trigger my controller, right? Let's take a look at that. That's triggering send, so it's going to trigger this action send function. So I'm not going to go through all of this code, but basically it's just doing a couple of little checks. If we have reCAPTCHA enabled, it's going to validate against reCAPTCHA. And then finally, it's going to determine whether it's going to be a JSON request or not. And then I have a lot of the guts of this code in my service. So here, we're getting our response from the service, which is doing the bulk of the work here. So adding contact, and we're just sending along the email. Craft, Pronto subscribe, add contact. We open our service, and I have that here as well. There is a little bit going on in this service where I'm just pulling stuff from settings. That's pretty much all this does. Craft plugins, get plugin, Pronto subscribe, get settings, and then just kind of holding on to those till I need them. This is pretty much all the code that I wrote, plus a little bit here, and then a ton of this is like their vendor terrible SOAP code. So sorry, I'm not going to go through all of that. There is like a certain level of validation happening here, making sure it's getting added to the right list ID, all that stuff. Switching back over to our craft version of this, you can see I have all the same parts. My variable looks same-ish. It's doing all the same stuff where it's storing the old template path and all that. You still have to do that trick, but it doesn't look too different. My form, I pretty much just copy and paste it over. You do have to make sure that you're using CSRF with Craft 3, BT dubs, controllers. This doesn't look too different. Action send is still very much the same. How we call certain plugin things and interact with our service does change a little bit, but it's not too crazy. And then services, okay, all of my terrible SOAP code is still in here. But a lot of this works the same. So that is Pronto subscribe. Oh, and let me show you. I just ported it to Craft 3 yesterday. And comment that. Sorry if I'm making people like sick from my spaces. Craft 2, index. So my form variable I'm using to spit out this form with just a couple of options, so people can kind of customize this a little bit. Like you can add classes to your buttons and give label text. This is just pulling in that twig form that I showed before, so you can use all of your conditionals and everything like normal in there. So I'm spitting out my form. Did I hit save? Nope. Okay, so I have my form. Oh, right, and this isn't going to work because I'm not on Wi-Fi. Think I'll get lucky with the Wi-Fi? Unlikely. So I'll kind of turn that off. You guys can see my lovely SOAP error that's going to happen. Yay! I did account yesterday for a little bit of a SOAP error, so if it tries to connect and the authentication fails, it fails gracefully, but I realized this morning I am not failing gracefully in the case where there's no internet at all. So forgive me. All you really would have seen is a message come up that, sorry, I was unable to authenticate with Pronto. You're not missing anything exciting. And of course, this is the exact same plugin that's being used for our Stay in Touch page on White House Historical Association, same deal. It's just styled a whole lot nicer. So that's controllers, settings, services, all that stuff. You can kind of see how they end up interacting, and it ends up looking like, working kind of like my diagram before. So I'm going to show you one more thing, which is building admin pages. So control panel. What is your control? How do you do your control panel section within Craft? So in this case, we're going to add one more thing to our scaffolding when downloading from pluginfactory.io, and that would be well, we're adding a couple things. In this case, we're going to add models and records. That's not something that you need for control panel. This plugin just happens to need it because we're going to use those control panels to save things. I'm going to show you Trevor built Reroute a little while ago. Basically, it's a plugin for taking URLs that you want to reroute via a 301 redirect. So we need the old URL, the new URL that it's going to route to, and then you can choose the method by which you do that, but typically we always do 301s in my experience. But we need models and records to kind of save those. We're not actually toggling on another thing for control panel. I'll kind of show you how we end up building those, but you don't toggle on a new thing, at least not with Craft 2. With Craft 3, there is a new toggle for control panel sections, and those work a little bit differently. I'm not going to get into the Craft 3 version today. I'm just going to do the Craft 2. And I'll show you that. Let me show you what reroute looks like in practice. So see, we've created a control panel section, so it ends up showing up on our tabs on the left. And we are going to create a new reroute. So let's say we don't want anyone to go to /test anymore. We want them to go to test new. Method 301, it could also be a 302 redirect. Hit save. Ta-da, we have a new record, and that's saved in our database, and our lovely user can now see everything that they've added for that. So this is the interface that we're basically recreating. And how that looks in our plugin for reroute. A lot of the stuff is going to look pretty familiar. We have controllers still. We have services, templates, variables. All that stuff's pretty familiar from the previous examples. In our base plugin, you see all the same stuff. We have our developer. The version number is 1.0.4 this time. You can actually get this on GitHub. But we are going to change has CP section to true. There's two big things that we have to change in here for a control panel section for Craft 2. That has to be true. And then also you have to register your CP routes. So in this case, we are saying we want reroute /new to have the template of form from our templates folder. And then reroute /ID would be like if we were pulling up one that already existed and has an ID, we're also pulling out reroute /form. So to show you that in practice, we only saw the new form. But see, we have a nice little ID in our URL, and it's going to pull up the same template. We have our form template, which gets pulled up when you're hitting all of your routes. And then we also have an index.html, which is going to be the route list of all of those routes at our control panel route. So pretty straightforward to making those. But then the form that we have does hook up to our controller, just like we had before. Reroute /save. I go in my controllers. I have my save action. This one does use models, so it's going to use the service to get stuff by ID or create a new model. Then we're going to take our data from our form and apply that to the model and validate it. So we're still following our order of operations in the controller, but the service is still doing the work. Like, we're not loading in models directly in the controller. We're still talking to our service to do a lot of that stuff, but this is still doing our order of operations. We want to validate before we actually save anything, and we want to make sure we're handling error cases. Services. Since we're dealing with records and models, you are going to see a little bit more kind of back and forth with the database here. So we're kind of initiating our record from our record model. You can get stuff from the database, which doesn't use the record directly necessarily. But we are getting things by ID. So this record, find by PK, reroute ID, that's getting us all of our data. Get by URL is needed in some cases instead of by ID. But the controller was using reroute create, and reroute save. So create for creating a new model, and then save for actually saving everything. I don't want to go through this too much, but hopefully that gives you an idea of like the model that you can follow for all of that stuff. All that makes sense so far? Okay. Back to here, just to wrap up. Those are the examples, and hopefully you guys can kind of see and practice how all of those pieces kind of work together. The things that I didn't cover are kind of extras that you can add that are very plugin specific, like if you need to do console commands. I have not written a plugin that needs to do console commands, so you can ask Brandon about that or somebody else. But then there's also a ton of other things you can do. You can add widgets, you can do all of that kind of stuff. There's plenty of documentation on all of that. A couple of resources just to kind of leave you guys off with. Of course, pluginfactory.io times 10 more times. That's a really great resource for getting started, especially when you're converting Craft 3 plugins. The couple of times I've done it, I've preferred to just build new scaffolding and kind of shift things over rather than trying to rework the files that I have. So it's really helpful when converting too. If you're going to do a lot of plugin development, definitely check the coding guidelines. Make sure you're following the standards and everything else. If all else fails, take a look at some of the plugins that Pixel and Tonic have built themselves. They're always great resources to kind of see how they'd prefer to structure things, or maybe some unspoken rules on how to name things or whatever else. Also, there is a plugin conversion sheet in their docs as well, which is really helpful if you're already familiar with a lot of the patterns used in Craft 2. It kind of just shows you, here's the Craft 2 version, here's the Craft 3 version. So that made converting my variable for Bronto subscribe, getting that form to actually like spit out that little bit of trick, that little trick you had to do where you save the old template path and all that. The code for that changed a lot, and it was a really easy cheat sheet of like, here's the old version. Oh wait, that looks just like my old version. Let me put in the new one. And then of course, like I mentioned, just taking a look at Pixel and Tonic's different plugins can really be helpful. I kept taking a look at their contact form plugin over and over. It doesn't have any services in it, but it does have controllers and some little stuff. So just kind of following that for conventions, especially while Craft 3 is so new and they're still working on some of the documentation, just kind of following their patterns can be a great place to start. And here's my optional part 2, but I'm guessing we don't quite have time for that one, and I'm getting a head shaking no, so we're going to skip past that. And we are going to call it a day for today. Thank you. So.